referring recently to his resignation, he said this: "I knew that he who wields the knife never wears the crown." Joe Haynes is political editor and chief leader writer on Robert Maxwell's Daily Mirror. For several years, Mr. Haynes was press secretary to Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and he wrote some remarkable revelations about government at the top in his book, The Politics of Power. And here is a thought to bring tears of nostalgia to Mr. Haynes' eyes. It's almost exactly 10 years since Joe Haynes was last sitting at a table with Tony Benn and Roy Jenkins. That was in number 10 Downing Street at Harold Wilson's resignation dinner in March 1976. Those were the days. There we are, and here we go, and our first question is from Miss Hilary Smith, who is the secretary. Hilary Smith, please.
Thank you, Sir Robin. Given the Labour Party's National Executive's decision to discipline some of its militant tendency members in Liverpool, does the panel believe, as Mr. Kinnock presumably does, that this will help boost the Labour Party's electoral fortunes?
Roy Jenkins.
I don't think it will harm them, but I believe that getting rid of 10 to 16 people in Liverpool is not going to restore the health of the Labour Party, because if it is necessary to expel people because of their association with militant tendency, you can't stop with 10 to 16 people in Liverpool. Why do you leave out the 2 members of Parliament, which they've specifically said they're going to, one for Coventry, one for Liverpool? Why do you leave out many people in the rest of the country? The fact of the matter is that this militant tendency, and some other groups too, are a cancer which has got so deep into the body of the Labour Party now that the idea that 10 or 16 expulsions are going to deal with it is absolutely hopeless. As a matter of fact, you can't really deal with these issues by expulsions. I suppose if I were in the Labour Party, I'd be in favour of them. Now, I never liked expulsions much. What I believe is much more necessary is a position in which the Labour Party does not pretend to be all things to all men, right across the left spectrum, and for years has welcomed people in who had no faith in democracy, no belief in democratic politics, no touch with the British electorate, and then it suddenly looks surprised when it finds they've taken over the House in a great number of places.
Tony Benn.
Well, I've got a long memory, of course. My predecessor in Bristol, Stafford Cripps, was expelled on a motion moved by George Brown. Nye Bevan was expelled. I was in the House of Commons when Nye had the whip withdrawn, and only by 1 vote was he saved from expulsion again from the party. Michael Foot was expelled. Jim Mortimer was expelled. And, I'll be blunt with you, Roy. You talk about cancer. I feel very strongly about people whose entire life depends on the working class movement. Your father was a miner. He was in jail in the general strike. You got into Parliament as a Labour member. Every office you held was because of the Labour Party. Cabinet Minister, appointed by a Labour Prime Minister, and then you left the party. Now that's a cancerous growth. Not personally, but I think people who betray those who gave them power are the real threat. And I must say that bluntly to you, because I think that needs to be said. Now, having said that, let me say that this is not primarily about militant, because remember Arthur Scargill was attacked during the strike. Bernie Grant, the black leader in London, was attacked. And the black sections are attacked. I think the question that was put by Hilary, is that your name at the beginning, it's done in the hope of being popular. But the point is, as Roy made out quite clearly, when you start, there's no end. You've got to expel every socialist till the Labour Party becomes like the SDP. And if you're sitting at home, and heaven preserve us from that, if you're sitting at home and you haven't got a job and your mum's waiting for a hip operation, you haven't got a decent house, and you're unemployed, and then you open your papers and you find the Labour Party has spent the whole day discussing Liverpool councillors or whatever their faults of fighting like tigers for the people of Liverpool who've been very badly treated in the period, I think they think it's irrelevant. The only last thing I'd say, because a lot of people of the Labour Party feel very discouraged about this, as I did, they're always let back again. Michael Foot, Stafford Cripps became Chancellor, Michael Foot became leader, George Lansbury was rather like the Liverpool people in jail, became leader of the Labour Party. So don't worry, they'll all be back. But at the moment, we're going through this phase where you try to win an election by being popular with the Daily Mirror, and I'm sure that Joe Haynes...
Come back a moment. You think you're promising us Derek Hatton being leader of the Labour
I'm not.
Party?
I'm only saying, Roy, that the people that were expelled were the people who got to the top, Jim. But you remember Michael Foot being expelled. I expect you did vote for him. But at least people who stay for voters' expulsion, the people who stay true to those who put them in power, these are the people I admire, not the people who climb into power on the backs of others, kick away the ladder, and are presented by everybody as men of principle and moderates.
Now we have
and I feel very strongly, so I've made my case, and there you are.
I have two other people on the table too who are going to have a talk. Joe Haynes first.
Michael Foot is not Derek Hatton, and they don't share the same philosophy. It was Michael Foot who said that Hatton was or that the militant tendency was a pestilential nuisance. I haven't left the Labour Party. I've been a member of it for just over 40 years now. I can't conceive that I would leave the Labour Party, but I have nothing in common with Derek Hatton. I have nothing in common with the militant tendency. And nor, Tony, do I think that they are socialist. Not by my definition. Militant openly boasts that it's a Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist organisation. Three gentlemen who have, whatever their merits, have nothing to do with me, nor the kind of party that I've belonged to. I do believe the question was, would it help the Labour Party? Would it help its fortunes? Yes, there was an opinion poll this week which showed that 27% of the people in Fulham would be more inclined to vote Labour if action was taken against militant. But so that, in a sense, makes it more popular. But we shouldn't do this for popularity. Indeed, some, Eric Heffer and others, have said that this is the death wish, and far from being popular, it will make us unpopular. Well, I would sooner be unpopular and without the militant tendency than popular and with it.
Michael Heseltine.
Well, I must say, it's something of an intrusion for me to involve myself in this debate between former colleagues of Mr. Wilson's government.
Don't be shy about it.
But I can overcome my reticence because, I mean, what you've got to realise about militant tendency and the extreme left, there's nothing new in it. It's been there ever since the Labour Party was founded. There's always been this distinction between the moderate Labour members like Roy Jenkins and the extreme Labour members like Anthony Wedgwood Benn. Although to listen to him talking about betraying the working class, you'd think he came from the working class.
I'm the only one who is from the working class.
Here is real middle-class privilege. Talking as though somehow or other it was born in working class circumstances to defend the British working classes. That is cant and hypocrisy. And I think it ought to be said very clearly and very loudly. But the fact of the matter is this, that all my life I have watched extremism in the Labour Party. I saw it in the winter of discontent that destroyed Mr. Callaghan's government. I remember Hugh Gateskill fight and fight again. And I have always believed that the only way in which, in fact, you could deal with extremism in a political party was for those who believed Roy Jenkins. It is not that he left the Labour Party, it's that he left the Labour Party only when it was defeated. He was quite content with all the extremism in the Labour Party when he was a member of the cabinet, when he was a member of the government. He went through all the extremist tendencies of the 40s, the 50s and the 60s, but when the electorate kicked the Labour Party out, Roy Jenkins abandoned the Labour Party. I agree with that criticism that Wedgwood Benn has actually made of it. But if you say to me, are the British people suddenly going to be conned in thinking that the threat of kicking out a couple of loonies in Liverpool has somehow purged a great historic phenomenon of extremism? Of course they're not going to be conned into that.
Okay, Hilary Smith, you asked the question. You've achieved the remarkable result of getting Michael Heseltine to be in agreement with Tony Benn, but what do you want to say?
Well, I believe Eric Heffer has referred to the Labour Party without militant tendency as SDP Mark II. And given the limited fortunes of the SDP at the moment, I can't help feeling that the Labour Party are going to lose out either way, whether they've got militant tendency or not.
What do you say to that, Roy Jenkins?
I think the Labour Party probably is going to lead out, but you won't be surprised here. I want to reply a little to Tony Benn.
But just on Hilary Smith's point about the Labour Party without militant to be like the SDP Mark II.
It'll be a very inferior version of the SDP.
Okay, now reply to Tony Benn, but not too lengthily because this is an audience programme.
Indeed it is, and I hope the audience will come in very much. But what Tony Benn is saying to me is that what he believes is that somebody should advocate policies they do not believe in, yes, certainly, in order to bow down between the altar of what he calls the working class and labour unity. He speaks, as Michael Heseltine did, as the son of a viscount, and somebody educated with the utmost privileges, up to a point I was too. But he speaks with the working class, with that detached knowledge, which only somebody from his background can quite achieve.
Yes,
the working class has become something very different these days, and people have very different aspirations. But what he is saying to me is that I would have been right to have stayed and spoken in favor of policies coming out of Europe, destroying NATO, massive nationalization, destruction of any private education, any private health service, moving towards a semi-East European state. That would have been all right within the tabernacle of the Labour Party. I believe that any politician who appeals for the votes of the British public has a higher duty than just to stick within a party, however much he disagrees with the people there. And when that position arises, I believe he should speak out and say what is right for the country.
Let me have some questions from the audience, because I don't want this programme, interesting though it is, I don't want this programme to become entirely a biographical discussion of Mr. Roy Jenkins' political career, because we're on the question of militant tendency, but he was right to reply to Tony Benn if he wanted. Sir, at the back.
Thank you. Mr. Benn glosses over the extreme bully boy tactics of the tendency, but I'm far more concerned with the report I heard a couple of years ago of Mr. Golding, the moderate Labour member of the NEC, who said that when he was sitting in the executive during those dark years when this was developing, he made or moved resolutions about doing something about the tendency, but could not find a seconder. And founders of the SDP were sitting in that chamber with him. They only started to fight when they got outside the ring, and it was easy. And now they're in great danger of letting this new extreme Labour Party, which has developed as a result of their activity, or not as a result, but which they didn't try to really stop, they're letting that in great danger of coming on the inside by default in the next general election.
What do you think of what the NEC decided yesterday and Tony Benn objected to?
I think they're taking the right steps now, but they are far too late, because Mr. Golding could not find a seconder when he proposed this sort of action, and people who founded the SDP were sitting around that table and sat on their hands and didn't second him.
Yeah.
Only started to fight outside the ring.
Gentleman up there, thank you, sir.
Given the way that Robert Maxwell has treated his workforce over the last few years, and given the fact that Robert Maxwell is still a member of the Labour Party, isn't it about time the Labour Party started asking itself how such right-wing extremists managed to infiltrate the party?
You wonder. I just want to get exactly. I didn't quite hear what you were saying. Did you say? Are you saying you think the Labour Party ought to expel Robert Maxwell?
Well, yes, I think the way that he's acted...
Joe, would you like to have a view on that?
So far, as far as I know, there have been several attempts to expel Robert Maxwell, which the NEC, in its infinite wisdom, has decided not to do. I don't think that Robert Maxwell has beaten up his employees, and given them their jobs back. And if we must divert to Robert Maxwell, has given compensation that ranges from $4,000 to $70,000, which is more than Mr. Murdoch has done. He hasn't even given his sacked workers a Fulton stamp.
Gentleman there.
Sir Robin, we forget that in the Labour Party, Lord Underhill, had a report on militant tendency back in 1975. And it's quite untrue to assert, as it has been tonight, that no one was standing against the extremist infiltration, which started about 1973 when the Labour Party lifted the prescription clause. And that is something which people reject, but it's nevertheless true. And there were people, and Tony Benn supported their expulsion in 1980.
No.
You did?
No.
December the 18th, 1980.
No.
I was expelled. Thank you very much, Mr. Benn. You supported my expulsion.
I'm sorry, I'm sure your case is extremely interesting. Do I know your name?
My name's Roger Fox, Sir Robin. I'm sorry to bring up a personal matter.
What were you expelled for?
I was expelled because I was a Social Democrat, and we said we would stand against extremist candidates.
Ah, yes. Tony Benn supported... Did you support...
No, I mean, the Labour Party rule is you can't be a member of the party and stand against it, but I want to reserve my reply. There's nothing whatever to do. You expelled yourself. But that's nothing whatever. But I would like to come back.
Absolutely.
Can I come back?
Tony, come on.
Can I come back? Because I am not prepared to take lectures on democracy from somebody, from somebody who was president of a commission, never elected by anybody. You worked for Harold Wilson, who made 243 peers, and now for Maxwell, and from a man in a government who'll sell anything. I tell you this, if Galtieri had offered to buy the Falklands instead of invade it, they'd have sold it to him. And we're told that patriotic democracy comes from them. I'm not prepared to take any lessons from these people at all. The reality is, and if you stood against the Labour Party, then that is
I didn't stand. I don't stand.
Anyway, the only rule is people who stand against, which is reasonable.
I was expelled
well,
for not
it's
standing.
reasonable. That's a different thing. You can't both be in a party and opposing it. But the point is this: everything that was said, not as a candidate, everything that was said about the militant was said about Nye Bevan. I remember it.
Yes, let's not go over all those again.
Robin, I'm going to make my point.
I know, but you made it already.
Robin, stop
very eloquently. I heard it. Cripps, Bevan, George, Brown, Rand, everybody. Gentlemen up at the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I find it incredible that Joe Haynes can describe a group of councillors in Liverpool who have been trying to carry out Labour Party policy and Labour Party local government policy in terms of defending jobs and defending services, and I think have got a proven track record, if you look at the number of houses that have been built in Liverpool, as not being socialist. That's what the movement's all about, doing those
Joe Haynes.
And as far as myself being an extremist, I support the militant newspaper. I've been described as a bully boy and as extremist. Can anybody here imagine me being a bully boy? Yeah. As far as I'm concerned.
Let's remember what this inquiry was into. It wasn't into the militant tendency, it was into the behaviour, the practices of the District Labour Party, which the gentleman up there suggested was only concerned with local government. I happen to have a list, which I know Tony has as well, of the items that were discussed at the District Labour Party. Just let me give you a couple.
You're not going to read them all.
I'm not going to read them all, no. But
I'll tell you what's in them. They discuss politics. That's the great... You listen very carefully.
No, but yes.
They discuss politics.
I'll tell you the things they discussed. They discussed the militant editorial board.
Yes.
They called for the resignation of Len Murray, the invasion of Grenada, the GHCQ...
They didn't call for it. They objected to a Commonwealth country being invaded by Reagan.
I'm talking about what they discussed.
Yes.
This, as you know, Tony, is the NEC's appendix, which gives the things they discussed. They discussed nuclear weapons.
Quite right.
Quite well, possibly, except that this is supposed to be a forum for discussing local government.
If Liverpool's destroyed, it'll be destroyed by nuclear weapons. So
they discussed Nicaragua.
Quite right, yes.
And they also discussed the planning of a supermarket in Liverpool, for which it would be libelous to go too far, but the planning permission is not the function of a district Labour Party.
But is there
and what
anything...
we had in Liverpool was an enormous number of abuse. It's been fiddling on a gigantic scale.
But you may think that those subjects were improper for them to discuss. That's a matter of opinion. But
it's not a matter.
Is there anything corrupt or contrary to Labour Party rules in those discussions?
Robin, this is the... Can I...
Yes, come in, Michael.
The interesting thing...
Because you were Minister for Merseyside.
Well, there were two points that I would make. One is that actually the reason why these militant members, I understand, are in trouble is not because of the policies. It is because of the procedures and the abuses of the procedures that they have adopted that they're in trouble. Why? Because if ever it were to be thought that you were to pursue people in the Labour Party for their policies, no matter how extreme, there's no end to it. And Tony Wedgwood Benn is quite honest about it. He says he's not going to take lessons in everybody. That's the whole problem.
You abolished democracy in London, Heseltine. You abolished the Greater London Council, and you talk about democracy in Liverpool. Half a minute, people ought to listen to what you're saying. You took away the rights of Londoners to elect their own council at all.
If you would ever listen, you might learn, but you will never listen and you will never learn. The reason why we don't need 3 elected bodies in London is because it's more expensive than we can do it with 2. That's why we got rid of the GLC.
Don't let's debate the abolition of the GLC again now. And I've got the militant matter and the Liverpool militant matter won't be settled one way or the other this side of the Labour Party conference. It's going to go on for a lot of weeks, so we'll come back to it again. And I would like to move on to another subject which is of great concern to a lot of ordinary people of both sexes. Mr. John Proctor, who is a lecturer. Your question, Mr. Proctor, please.
Good evening, Sir Robin.
Good evening to you.
The decision by the European Court of Justice has found that the compulsory early retirement of women in public service is against the common market's anti-discrimination laws. Is this therefore the time for the government to decide on a flexible retirement scheme enabling people to choose when to retire at any age between 60 and 70, and in doing so provide welcome job opportunities for unemployed 18 to 25-year-olds?
Mr. Proctor, thank you for your lucid question. Tony Benn, would you like to answer?
Yes, I'm in favour of early retirement on a voluntary basis because I think people should be able to go on. And undoubtedly, if you did have retirement possible at 60 for men, a lot of people would go to make room for younger people. Mind you, you don't solve the problem of unemployment by job sharing because, or by earlier retirement, but we should reduce the retirement age and we should raise the school leaving age to 18 to retire. It would be on the basis that the state pension was available to men at 60. In civil servants, anyway, retire on, earnings-related pensions at 60 anyway. It's manual workers who go to 65, and there's a class distinction, not just between distinction between men and women, but between people of different work. But of course, cost. You see, £16 billion we're going to spend on that Trident missile. Now, I'm not suggesting it be spent on everything, but why don't we give priority to older people, work for the young, schools, housing in Liverpool? Why don't we put the money to where it's needed instead of spending it on, selling our industries abroad to anyone who'll buy them and wasting it on defence? I think that's the real question we've got to determine.
It is just how I may say so. It is a classic example of Anthony Wedgwood Benn's technique. He has got no idea what the cost of Trident is going to be. He simply invented a figure and then gives the impression as though that is available. It isn't 16 billion. There is no shred of evidence. The last figure was under 10 billion, and there is no shred of justification for the figure you have created in order to try and make a political statement.
Well, 10 billion would pay for pensions.
You just simply invented it.
10 billion would pay for pensions.
Let us not get into Trident at this stage because Mr. Don Lee, who is a head teacher, has another question to take us into which is of great interest.
Good evening, Sir Robin.
Yes, please.
I wonder if I could ask the gentlemen around your table if they believe that any part of British Leyland should be sold to a foreign interest, and if so, what they believe the long-term consequences would be.
Michael Heseltine.
Well, I'm not going to say that there is an answer which automatically and without facts and without any information of detail of the alternatives, you can say yes or no, because I don't think you can do that. What I would say very clearly is that there are very considerable anxieties that I have and many people have, which would indicate to me that I would rather not see that happen. And I will tell you why. Because I think that in a situation where multinational companies very legitimately and very honorably are pursuing their own interests, whether they're Japanese or French or American, those interests are not essentially British. And that when times get hard, or when they are pursuing their own national and legitimate interest, the temptation is for them to do the design and the high technology work in their own country, for them to withdraw work to their own factories when the economic recessions blow. And if you do not have control over those major parts of the production process, like aircraft, like frigates, like helicopters, like cars, like lorries, whatever it may be, then you lose the ability to be certain that all those hundreds of thousands of jobs that go to the subcontractors, let alone the main contractors, are kept in your country. And so I think you do need an industrial strategy which asks these basic questions. For that reason, I am anxious. And then I look to see what has happened in earlier cases where, in the case of Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, there have been purchases of first small stakes, then growing stakes of British motor companies. And whilst assurances have been given, I'm sure in the best of faith, in the early initial phases, actually when you look at what has happened, the assurances have not been maintained in anything like the scale that I would like. And so for that reason, I think it is very, very important that all the arguments are thoroughly explored and preferably a British solution is found. And I think that if you can't find a British solution, I would rather find a European solution, and I would say that because I believe that the partnership across the Atlantic with the Americans, which is essential for our defense, depends upon an equality of partnership between European and American companies. Britain alone is not big enough and never will be to provide the companies that can be genuine partners with America. But Europe is big enough, and Europe should try to get its own industrial house in order so that we have a technological and a high-skilled base base in the manufacturing capabilities of Europe to be an effective Atlantic partner. Now that means a different approach to the one that I think is the favoured approach now in the context of British Leyland.
But if Mrs. Thatcher were here, she would say to you, but where is the alternative coming from if you don't like British Leyland going to America?
But they have made it clear that the bids will be countenanced. There are alternative bids. I understand there's a management buyout for Land Rover, for example. And there's a very exciting precedent in what had happened with Jaguar. A very exciting precedent what happened with
Joe Haynes?
The past isn't very optimistic. Roots were bought by Chrysler.
Right.
Chrysler then collapsed. I think Peugeot took it over. In both instances, it led to a great many jobs being lost. What happened if General Motors fell? It used to be said that what was right for General Motors was right for America. It's not necessarily what's right for General Motors is going to be right for Britain. If General Motors run into difficulty in America, then they will do what Chrysler did. Chrysler were losing billions in America, and so they drew in their horns overseas in order to protect their base. That's what worries me. If it's taken over, even by a British firm, whether it becomes Land Rover or whatever, so the one way of describing it. What happens if they fail? Is the government, having privatised it or sold it off, to have to come in and step in and buy it up again? The last Labour government didn't want to buy BL. It was a crisis that was thrown upon us by the collapse of the private management, which was totally incompetent. I hope that's not libelous. It was totally incompetent. We had to buy it. We have invested a great deal of money in it. But our investment doesn't begin to match the kind of investment that, for example, that Volkswagen had. BL may be a mass producer in this country. It is actually a very small motor manufacturer compared with our competitors.
But if you're saying our investment is small compared with our competitors, isn't that what people who want the American offer to be taken up are
I think General Motors want it because the Land Rover, Range Rover range is technologically much more advanced than the Bedford trucks, which are now old-fashioned. They'll probably stop that line of production, and perhaps the Bedford people will be put out of work.
Tony Benn, you were Secretary of State for Industry.
Yes, when Leyland collapsed, of course. But I had a letter this morning from a man who works for General Motors. He said the government first approached General Motors to buy Leyland last summer. The Americans realized the Jeep production was going to end, and they wanted to find an alternative source. And the Prime Minister said, if you buy Land Rover, this was last summer, then of course you will own it, but you will have a good product. Now, I do not know whether that is true, but if it is true, or anything like it is true, we have been presented with a wholly fraudulent case. What I would say is this. We've got oil, and we should have used the oil revenues, which have been worth £1,344 a person, to re-equip and expand our industrial base. I also say this too. We've had all this about ballots for workers. You've got to have a ballot to elect your union executive, a ballot before industrial action, a ballot before you can have a political fund. I believe that the future of companies should be determined by a ballot of the workers who put their life into those companies. Because Michael Heseltine favoured the European solution for Western, the government the American solution. But nobody ever said, what about the people who worked at Westerns for all those years? What do they want? They were just bought and sold like slaves. And I am in favour of industrial democracy. Yes, they were. And of course, you notice General Motors have offered £40 million or dollars for redundancy. I think it's quite possible that if General Motors buy Land Rover, they'll move the production to America, close it down, and all that investment will disappear from Britain. But the same would be true in Europe. You might very well find European companies. You've got to have an industry. Put your oil revenues into it and let the people who create the wealth have a greater say in determining how it's used. That's my belief.
Roy Jenkins, back. Now, refresh your mind on Mr. Lee's question.
I was going to come back to Mr. Lee's question. I was only going just in passing to say I'm not sure that it's very sensible or proper Tony Benn to introduce a bit of information. And then say, I have no idea whether that's true or not.
Typical.
But I thought it might be interesting. However, let me come back to Mr. Lee's question, which is, should any parts of British Leyland be sold to the Americans? Well, there are, broadly speaking, three parts. There's Land Rover, there's the truck division, and there's the main motor car manufacturing division. Land Rover, no. Land Rover happens to be one of the things we do extremely well in this country, and to get rid of this, to throw this away, when, to be honest, we haven't got all that many things we do terribly well at the present time, seems to me extremely foolish, without being anti-American, without being chauvinist in any way. The large General Austin Rover group, well, we've already got Fords and General Motors controlling two major manufacturing groups in this country. To put ourselves in a position different from any European country in which we give the whole of our mass market motor manufacturing over to American control seems to me going too far. And I think that certainly we ought not to be in that position, and if the unit is not viable, is not big enough on its own, then I would seek a European partner which can be a partnership of equality rather than an American partner which is inevitably a partnership of the owned to the owned.
Mr. Lee?
Let me answer the question completely as you put it to me. The only thing I would have slight doubt about is the truck division. Part of the truck division happens to be in my own constituency, and there both management and, as far as I can make out, both sides of industry are rather in favour. They've been so badly treated by this great British Leyland, which Tony Benn set up, so far as investment is concerned, that they think that they would probably have a better investment deal if they were bought by somebody like General Motors, and certainly the operation is too small to be viable at the moment. But I would not certainly let the mass motor manufacturing or Land Rover go over in this way, because I think if we're doing that, we are moving into a lower league than Italy, France, Germany, any major European country.
Mr. Lee.
I'm sorry to ask a question where everyone seems to have agreed with each other for
Yes,
once.
I know. I'm going to ask Mr. Heseltine whether he thinks the government can go ahead in the face, not just of the views on this table, but a fairly widespread opposition to the idea of letting some of BL go to the Americans, particularly Land Rover.
No, I think that the government have behaved extremely sensibly in setting up a group of ministers with specialist interest and with a wide political feel, I think, for the circumstance, in order to look now at the options that are available. And I think everyone was very encouraged by that. I think it is very, I mean, Roy Jenkins made an important point. There are industrial problems about trying to run a certain scale of industry. And it isn't a question of being sort of chauvinistic. You can't just simply say, well, we don't care what the industrial arguments are. It's simply going to be British and that's that, because that might be to get the worst of all deals. You've got to have all the facts. You mustn't take a rushed decision. You certainly mustn't preclude British solutions because you don't consider them. I think now that the process is underway, and I very much share Roy Jenkins' view, who saw Tony Benn's typical technique of quoting from a letter. No one knows who it came from, no one knows whether it's true, but it becomes a sort of propaganda technique of trying to discredit the government.
Well, Clive Ponting was very handy, wasn't he? He told us a lot of stuff.
Would you like to finish your supplementary point, because I interrupted you?
Yes, I simply want to agree with Tony Benn, because I'm actually from Bedford, but my family is all from Oxford, and many of my families have been the very slaves that Tony Benn talks about. It seems extraordinary to me, you know, that they should be thinking about selling off this kind of business interest, and I just really can't imagine any kind of government wanting to sell off anything that anybody wanted so badly from overseas.
Thank you. Let's have one or two. Yes, the lady there, please. Yes.
Me?
Yes, please, sir.
Yes. I think one of the problems in recent years, and certainly since 1979, has been a massive outflow of funds from this country due to exchange control relaxation.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to call you. You had a very eloquent earlier intervention. I meant the gentleman just behind you. I'm sorry, I must give everybody a chance. Who was it? Yes, the gentleman there.
What seems to be necessary is a European solution where, in fact, Europe has a plan for industry, because the motor industry must be rationalised. You've actually got to reduce the number of companies. And if you don't work with Europe, then you're not, in fact, going to end up with any motor industry in Europe at all. So that's what's necessary.
Sir, yes, thank you.
I do not think that a European or foreign intervention is necessary. On the roads, you see lots of trucks and with the legend EARF on the front, stands for ER Foden. It's a firm which has grown up since the war and is highly successful. Well, surely amalgamation with them and with Leyland trucks would be a very good idea. And furthermore, the Land Rover management want to have a management buyout, and has been pointed out that similar buyouts have been made very successfully, and surely the government should be assisting that, helping it, rather than trying to sell off Land Rover to a foreign company.
Well, there may be some agreement round the table with you on that. Let me have a couple more points. Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Heseltine's just
just said that the Committee of Ministers is now getting together very sensibly to look at the options. What I'm more concerned at, both in this point and the previous one about the joint ages, the committee is now looking at it, but only because it's come to light. These decisions were being made, and it wouldn't be a committee looking at it now, and this discussion would not be taking place if it hadn't been brought out that these secret negotiations have been going on for months. We're talking about changing the rules about retirement ages.
Well,
that's only come about because people, the European Court has said we're going to.
Let's not go back into that one. What about this new committee that should have been set up before?
I think with fairness. The question I'd like to ask, Robin. Sorry, I hadn't quite got.
I'd like to bring in Mr. Heseltine on your point. We'll forget the point you originally made.
It is. You are raising a serious point. The European Court is different because that's a formal announcement of a proper decision. You may not like it, but it has been taken and then it's been taken. But what you're suggesting is that because a story was leaked about negotiations which were being conducted in private, that somehow or other the government can be criticised for the decisions they hadn't taken. Now, I, as a former minister, and there were 3 former ministers on this cabinet, that makes government impossible, because you must be allowed to explore options and reach decisions, and only then be criticised for the decisions. The government had not made a decision. What I'm merely saying that in the process now of looking at the decisions that they have to make, which they haven't yet made, there is, we all know, a committee of ministers has been set up to look at the wider implications. That is perfectly reasonable. It's a very desirable thing. You don't know and I don't know, you cannot know, and I certainly can't know, how or what decision the government would have made left to its own devices. You cannot know. And in those circumstances, you cannot criticise for the government the decision it had not yet made.
Joe Haynes, I must let you make a contribution because these 3 politicians are extremely eloquent. You're very patient.
I'd like to behave like a journalist and ask, if you'll permit it, Michael Heseltine a question. I read, and it hasn't been denied, that Norman Tebbit approached when he was at Trade and Industry, approached General Motors in 1984. Mr. Heseltine was a member of the Cabinet until January of this year. Was he aware that these talks were going on?
No, I wasn't, and I've made that clear already. But to Robin, I think Robin asked me that question on another programme
last week.
And I said I wasn't aware. But what does that mean? It means that there had yet to come a formal process in which ministers were involved collectively. And in that situation, I would, of course, been involved. And other ministers would have been involved as well. And that means that the government cannot be criticised for early exploratory discussions with other companies.
Sorry, but they're large defence contracts, were they not?
That's what I'm saying. It's perfectly...
And you were Minister of Defence, and you knew nothing about it.
But they had not taken a decision.
Yeah. Well, now, I want to step in now because there's another question which we had a very great many cards put in, and it is represented now by Mr. John Wesley, who is a retired insurance inspector. Mr. Wesley.
Sir Robin, do the panel not think that President Reagan's and the USA's policy of propping up leaders and regimes like Marcos in the Philippines and many others across the world, for whatever reason, is not moral and is also counterproductive in general terms?
Michael Heseltine?
Well, I don't like to see undesirable regimes, and I don't obviously want to support any regime that could be put in that category. The fact of the matter is that the Americans, I think, played a rather impressive role in ensuring that in a democratic context, which might easily have led to bloodshed because Marcos didn't want to go, the troops might have been instructed to do all sorts of appalling things. The Americans actually intervened to say they wouldn't have it. And what happened? Marcos went, and they should be praised for that. Now, let's have no illusions. International power politics is not the easiest world in which to find the highest moral standards. It never has been, it never will be. What you have to realize is that there is a world struggle for supremacy between 2 great ideologies. Our interest, overwhelmingly, is in the American side of the argument. And what you have to understand is that the equivalent to what the Americans have done in the Philippines and the relative peaceful change from one democratic process to another, the equivalent is 100,000 troops in Afghanistan tonight using every form of brutality to suppress the people of Afghanistan. That is the choice, and never let it out of your mind in reaching judgments about the activities of the superpowers with which we have to do business.
Tony Benn.
It isn't really a conflict of ideologies in that sense, because don't please ever tell us that the Americans are there to protect human rights. Look at Chile, look at Greece under the colonels, look at Turkey, Look at Spain under Franco, look at Portugal under Salazar.
The only thing missing are any American troops, as you
know.
Yes,
well, just let me finish, Michael.
Well, we've heard it all before.
The truth is that NATO and the alliances, CATO and others around the world, ANZUS, are instruments of American power to preserve her economic interests, just as the British Empire performed the same function for us. And we're told all the time that the Americans are for freedom. They invaded Grenada, they tried to invade Cuba, they fought in Vietnam, they've got 30,000 troops here and 135 bases in Britain, including small bases and storage places, and they're controlled by Reagan. We don't elect and can't remove. And on the other hand, we're told, because I'm no supporter of the Soviet system, never have been, but we're told that the Russians... Of course I'm not. Of course I'm not. Nobody who's followed anything I've said could believe otherwise. But what I'm saying is that for years we've been told that if Mr. Heseltine and his predecessors were not waving an order form for a trident, Gorbachev would be dominating question time tonight. I don't believe that. I don't believe there's any evidence that the Russians have ever intended to invade Western Europe. The Russians, like the American, no, there's no evidence at all. Absolutely. The Russians lost 20 million people in the last war. Until the day I die, I shall reckon my liberty tonight was in part purchased with Russian blood. And let's say that, because a lot of people in Britain remember the fact that the Russians were our allies. So what I'm saying is the Americans and the Russians are both superpowers, but don't tell us it's some highfalutin argument about freedom. The Americans dominate those parts of the world where they have their troops to protect their interests, just as we did when we were the British Empire. That's all I'm saying. No more. A lot of people agree with that too.
I want to bring in Mr. Heseltine. Mr. Jenkins. I want to bring in Mr. Jenkins. No, I want to go round the table. Come on. We've got a short time. Trying to be fair.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
You know, I think that Tony Benn might remember that American blood has something to do with our freedom.
Oh, yes.
No, I think the Americans make a lot of mistakes.
But and British blood, too. British blood. Well, we fought before Pearl Harbor and before, so don't, if we're going to...
whoever would have assumed that
yes,
not
well, that's important.
You really mustn't go into such a state of chauvinistic hysteria that you believe that anybody knows no history except yourself.
Which you acknowledge the fact that innocence of reality is false.
But although I think American blood and American support has a good deal to do with our freedom. And while there's no absolute evidence as to what the Russians would have done, they did blockade Berlin, they did take over Czechoslovakia, they did do quite a lot of things of that sort, and they might have done a great deal more had NATO not been formed and the Americans not committed themselves to the defense of Europe. But the Americans make a lot of mistakes. I would have thought the last few weeks had been a rather good period from the toppling of rather undesirable people who might be regarded as broadly within the Western sphere of influence, showing that this can happen. I wouldn't mind seeing a few Eastern European dictators being toppled too.
Going the way of Duvalier and Marcos on Russian plains somewhere, perhaps.
Afghanistan or some nice resort they might be removed to.
Actually, Roy, we invaded Afghanistan 4 times in the last 100 years when we were an empire. Don't forget that bit of history too. We did 4 times when Britain invaded Afghanistan.
Presumably you didn't approve of that either.
Joe Haynes, please.
Beginning to sound like Northern Ireland.
Joe Haynes.
The question is it not moral? And the answer is yes, it is not moral, because we can't maintain democracy by propping up corruption. In this case, though, I will side to some extent with Roy. I think that Reagan was wrong at the beginning when he tried to be even-handed and saying, well, everybody cheats at elections. But then realised that this couldn't hold, and he withdrew his support from Marcos, which finished Marcos, which is far better than the previous American record in Vietnam, where they supported a corrupt government for a great many years, lost a good many thousand American lives, as well as the lives of the Vietnamese that were lost, and eventually had to pull out. Here he saw that Marcos was indefensible. Now, whether Mrs. Aquino is going to be any better, I don't know.
Mr. Wesley, what do you think?
Well, Sir Robin, I largely agree with the views of Joe Haynes. I was thinking from the morality point of view, particularly of the oppressiveness to the people who live in the country and the corruption. and really the poor judgment and the about-face that America has to do each time.
What do you think about the argument as between the regimes America is alleged to have influenced and the regimes and the countries which Russia has influence over?
Well, you know, you can go along with either Tony Benn or Roy Jenkins as to...
And which do you go along with, sir?
Well, I agree with both of them. They were our blood brothers in the war, and they both helped the war effort. I wouldn't distinguish between them from that point of view.
Mr. Heseltine?
Well, I mean, that really isn't realistic, because the fact is that the NATO alliance was formed because the Russians created the Berlin blockade and a Labour government asked the Americans to come back, most Americans having gone home, hopefully to live in peace. And so the history is totally clear that it was Russian occupation of Central European country after Central European country, and ultimately the provocation of the Berlin blockade, that brought the Americans back at our request.
One more comment from the floor, please, before we end the programme. Sir, at the back with the reddish hair, if you will forgive the description.
I actually agree with the point that Mr. Benn said when he said the Americans are defending their interests. Their interests are that of freedom, which we should all agree with, and the preventing the spread of communism. And I must correct him on a point. The Americans did not invade Grenada, they liberated Grenada, and the people of
I know that Tony Benn will not put that interpretation on it, but we're right at the end of the programme, so I'll allow you, sir, to have the last word. Thank you all very much indeed. In next week's Question Time, we have the Right Honourable Sir Geoffrey Howe, QC MP, the Foreign Secretary, Dr. John Cunningham MP, Labour's Environment Spokesman, Brenda Dean, General Secretary of SOGAT 82, and Sir John Harvey Jones, who is Chairman of ICI. That's in next Thursday's Question Time, another very impressive quartet at 10 p.m. on BBC One. Good night and thank you for joining us.
In 25 minutes, the latest developments and reminders from the Crime Watch team. But before that, on BBC One, the first of 5 programmes presented by Dr. Michael O'Donnell, asking the all-important question, can you avoid cancer?